There was something about the encrypted coordinates that didn't sit right with maritime historian Dr. Elena Vasquez. For 3 decades, she dedicated her life to cataloging lost Spanish galleons, studying centuries-old manifest documents in dusty archives across Seville, Cartagena, and Cadiz. But these coordinates, scrawled on the back of a 1920s salvage logbook she'd discovered in a private collection in Buenos Aires, they corresponded to a location in the Atlantic that was simply too deep, too remote, and too historically improbable to make sense. The coordinates pointed to a section of the mid-Atlantic ridge, roughly 3,000 meters below the surface, somewhere between the shipping lanes that modern vessels had traversed for nearly 4 centuries without incident. According to every historical record, nothing of significance had ever sunk in that region. Yet the logbook clearly referenced La Magnifica, a name that had been lost to history since 1687, when the vessel disappeared during what records only describe as an unfortunate incident in the northern waters. Vasquez spent 2 years chasing the ghost of that ship through archives across Europe. She cross-referenced merchant records, naval reports, and insurance documents. The more she dug, the more compelling the evidence became. La Magnifica wasn't just any Spanish galleon. It was a treasure ship that had been carrying an estimated 240 tons of refined gold, silver ingots, and cut emeralds from the mines of Potosi. The manifest listed the cargo at nearly $600 million in contemporary value, though in today's economy, with adjustments for scarcity and historical significance, the true value was incalculable. But here is where the story takes a turn that most historians would have dismissed outright. La Magnifica wasn't alone when it sank. According to the logbook, it had been traveling with another vessel, a support ship called El Viajero, which had apparently struck it in the dead of night during a violent Atlantic storm. Both ships went down within hours of each other. The few survivors who made it to safety told wildly conflicting stories, and the Spanish crown, already weakened by war and debt, decided to quietly abandon recovery efforts. In 1720, the official documents were sealed, the crew disbanded, and the location was consigned to obscurity, sealed away in vaults where it would remain undisturbed for 3 centuries. When Vasquez finally brought her findings to Dr. Marcus Kensington, a deep-sea salvage expert who'd made his fortune recovering precious cargo from the abyssal plains, he was skeptical. Kensington had conducted over 60 deep ocean expeditions, and he knew the mathematics of salvage operations at extreme depths. Every meter deeper meant exponentially greater pressure, colder temperatures, and more equipment failures. At 3,000 meters, you weren't just fighting the ocean, you were fighting the fundamental laws of physics. Deep sea salvage operations typically cost between $5 and $15 million, with success rates hovering around 50-50. But Kensington was also a gambler. And when Vasquez showed him the coordinates, the manifest, and the historical evidence, something clicked. He assembled a team of specialists, sonar technicians, deep-sea engineers, ROV pilots, maritime archaeologists, and logistics experts. In the spring of 2023, they departed from a research vessel equipped with the most advanced deep ocean exploration technology in the world. The first 2 weeks were dedicated to mapping the seabed. Multi-beam sonar swept across the predetermined area, creating a 3-dimensional landscape of the ocean floor. What they found was unexpected. The seabed in that region wasn't a smooth plain as most maps suggested. Instead, there were underwater ridges, deep trenches, and scattered debris fields that suggested significant geological upheaval. On the 15th day of sonar sweeps, something metallic registered on the instruments. At first, the team thought it was a false reading. Sonara often picked up basalt formations or mineral deposits that mimicked metal signatures, but the pattern was unmistakable. There was a large metallic mass buried under approximately 2 meters of sediment, and its dimensions roughly matched the known hull specifications of a 17th century Spanish galleon. Launching the ROV, a remotely operated vehicle the size of a small car, equipped with high-resolution cameras, cutting-edge sonar, mechanical arms, and sampling equipment, was the critical moment. The ROV, christened Profundis, began its descent into waters where the pressure exceeds 400 atmospheres, where the temperature hovers just above freezing, and where the darkness is absolute except for the ROV's powerful LED light. At exactly 3,042 meters, the seafloor came into view. And what the cameras revealed was nothing short of extraordinary. The bow of a massive wooden-hulled ship emerged from the sediment, its structure partially intact despite 3 centuries of submersion. The wood, preserved by the cold and pressure and the absence of oxygen in the deep ocean, showed minimal deterioration. The cross carved into the bow, the mark of Spanish royal vessels, was still distinctly visible. This was La Magnifica. As Profundis moved along the hull, the cameras captured details that made the team collectively hold its breath. Decorative bronze fittings remained in place. Ceramic amphorae used to store provisions and valuables were scattered across the seabed nearby. And then, in one of the ship's open cargo holds, the cameras caught a glint of something that made everyone in the control room go silent. Gold. Stacked wooden chests, their exterior corroded but still structurally sound, lined the hold, and around them, spilling across the seabed in dramatic abundance, were thousands upon thousands of gold coins. The discovery confirmed what Vasquez had theorized. La Magnifica had gone down so quickly, sunk by the collision with El Viajero in that violent storm, that much of her cargo had remained within the ship or fallen to the seabed in close proximity. The cold, the pressure, the absence of significant tidal movement at that depth, all of it had conspired to preserve something that should have been lost forever. The initial survey took 3 weeks. ROV dives lasting 4 to 6 hours per day systematically documented the wreck, recording 3-dimensional video footage and high-resolution imagery that would later become crucial for the salvage operation itself. The team identified at least 14 cargo holds containing wooden chests that almost certainly held precious metals. They estimated that the visible gold coins scattered across the seabed numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions. But seeing treasure and recovering it were 2 entirely different propositions. The first challenge was structural. La Magnifica was fragile. While the cold and pressure had preserved the wooden hull, it had also made the wood extremely brittle. Any aggressive attempt to extract cargo could cause a catastrophic collapse of the internal structure, potentially burying everything under tons of debris. Additionally, the ship was resting on a slope with the stern section partially suspended over a deeper trench. One miscalculation could send the entire aft section tumbling into the abyss. Kensington and his team designed an extraction protocol that would have been impossible even a decade earlier. They brought in a specialized heavy-lift ROV, capable of exerting precise mechanical pressure. The plan was painstakingly methodical. Rather than attacking the treasure directly, they would first need to stabilize the wreck. This meant carefully placing titanium support frames around the most fragile sections of the hull, essentially creating an exoskeleton that would hold the ship's remains in place while salvage operations proceeded. This stabilization phase alone took 2 months. ROV pilots, working shifts of 4 to 6 hours at a time, carefully maneuvered titanium frames into position. The pressure at 3,000 meters meant that even titanium components had to be specially engineered. Standard fasteners would fail. Welds made at the surface would crack under extreme pressure. Everything had to be precisely calculated. And then came the environmental challenges that nobody on the surface could truly anticipate. At that depth, the ROV systems were operating at the very edge of their design specifications. The batteries that powered Profundis had to be specially designed to maintain efficiency in 4-degree water. The mechanical arms had to be calibrated to compensate for pressure-induced friction that didn't exist in shallow water testing. The cables connecting the ROV to the surface vessel, 8 kilometers of specialized fiber optic and power transmission cable, required constant monitoring and adjustment. 3 weeks into the stabilization phase, disaster struck. One of the titanium support frames shifted unexpectedly, and the ROV got tangled in the cable loop. For 16 terrifying hours, the team faced the prospect of losing Profundis at a depth where replacement and recovery would be impossible. The cost of the ROV was $12 million. The cost of losing it at that depth was unrecoverable. But through careful manipulation and precise counter movements, the team managed to free the entanglement. When Profundis finally surfaced, the entire control room erupted in applause. Yet they couldn't afford to be complacent. The incident had demonstrated the razor-thin margin between success and catastrophic failure. Kensington called a meeting with his team. The decision was made to pause the stabilization efforts and redesign the approach. They would bring in additional specialized equipment, smaller, more maneuverable ROVs that could work in tandem, redundant systems for every critical function, and most importantly, advanced AI-powered object recognition systems that could identify and track specific treasure items without direct physical manipulation. This redesign required 3 additional months of preparation, redesign, and equipment fabrication. It pushed the expedition's timeline back by half a year and inflated the budget by another $4 million. But when operations resumed in late 2023, the new protocols proved dramatically more effective. The revised plan focused on extracting individual items rather than attempting to move entire chests. Smaller ROVs equipped with gentle suction systems and soft grip manipulators began carefully removing gold coins from the seabed surrounding the wreck. Each coin was individually documented, photographed, and placed in a collection container that would be gradually hauled to the surface. The process was tedious, mind-numbingly slow, and absolutely necessary. For 8 weeks, the team executed what would later be called the most meticulous marine salvage operation in history. Every single item recovered was documented. GPS coordinates were recorded for each location. High-resolution photographs captured every coin, every artifact in stunning detail. The data being collected wasn't just about treasure recovery. It was creating an unprecedented historical record of a moment frozen in time for 300 years. By the end of those 8 weeks, the team had recovered approximately 87,000 gold coins, totaling nearly 400 tons of weight and worth an estimated $218 million. But here's what made this discovery truly extraordinary. The coins themselves were historically priceless. Many were unique specimens, struck in limited quantities in 1,680 S-mints that no longer exist. Numismatists and historians were already beginning to argue that the historical and cultural value of these coins far exceeded their gold content value. The real breakthrough came when the team finally managed to extract one of the smaller cargo chests from within the ship's hold. Using an innovative series of soft-touch extraction protocols, they carefully removed the chest from the wreck without destabilizing the structure. When Profundis brought it to the surface, the entire international maritime community held its collective breath. The chest, when open on the research vessel deck under controlled conditions, contained 367 individually wrapped bars of refined gold, each weighing approximately 1 kilogram. But more remarkably, beneath the gold bars lay documents, original manifest pages written in 17th century Spanish script had been preserved in protective lead containers. These documents represented an invaluable historical archive that would reshape understanding of colonial Spanish maritime commerce. Word of the discovery had leaked to the international media weeks earlier, but when the actual images of the recovered chests were released, the story exploded globally. News networks ran continuous coverage. Maritime historians descended on academic conferences to debate the implications, and governments began quietly engaging with Kensington's team about the legal, political, and historical dimensions of such a discovery. This is where the narrative becomes even more complex. The treasure had been sunk in international waters, technically beyond the exclusive economic zone of any single nation. However, the Colombian government, as the inheritor of Spanish colonial territories and historical claims, immediately asserted rights to a significant portion of the cargo. The Spanish government, representing the original crown, made similar claims. The maritime salvage laws of multiple nations came into question. Insurance companies, some of which had paid claims on lost Spanish shipwrecks centuries ago, suddenly had vested interests in the recovery. Kensington's team continued working, aware that the legal landscape would take years to resolve. Over the next 6 months, they recovered additional chests, more coin caches, navigational instruments, cannons, and dozens of other artifacts. Each recovery was documented with meticulous precision. The total recovered value climbed steadily, 218 million, then 285 million, then finally $381 million in precious metals and artifacts. But the most significant discovery came near the end of the expedition. In the captain's quarters, Profundis located what appeared to be a personal safe, sealed in lead and coral encrusted with centuries of accumulation. The team extracted it with exceptional care. When it was opened on the surface, it contained something that changed the entire understanding of why La Magnifica had been sent to the bottom of the ocean in the first place. Inside the safe was an undiscovered journal written by Captain Felipe Rodriguez de la Cruz, commanding officer of La Magnifica. The journal's pages, preserved by the lead container and the deep-sea conditions, were still legible. In it, Rodriguez detailed a conspiracy among Spanish colonial officials to smuggle crown treasure to secret locations beyond the reach of the Spanish crown's political enemies. La Magnifica wasn't just a merchant vessel carrying routine cargo. It was part of an elaborate international intrigue involving French nobility, Portuguese merchants, and Spanish colonial administrators locked in a shadow war that never made it into official histories. The journal described how Rodriguez had been deliberately rammed by El Viajero, which had apparently been commandeered by political conspirators. The collision wasn't an accident. It was an assassination disguised as maritime disaster. La Magnifica and her treasure were meant to sink into obscurity, lost at sea with no survivors to tell the true story. The conspiracy worked perfectly for 300 years. It wasn't until Elena Vasquez found that stray logbook in Buenos Aires that the truth began to surface. The implications were staggering. This wasn't simply a shipwreck recovery, it was the uncovering of a centuries-old historical mystery that fundamentally altered the understanding of colonial Spanish history, maritime commerce, and international intrigue. The recovered treasure, now valued at slightly over $580 million, including preliminary historical assessment, suddenly seemed almost secondary to the historical narrative that emerged from Rodriguez's journal. As news of the journal and its contents spread through academic and historical circles, universities began offering record amounts for access to research it. Museums competed for exhibition rights. Book publishers signed contracts for multiple histories based on the discovery. What had begun as a salvage operation had evolved into one of the most significant historical discoveries of the century, rivaling in some aspects the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb or the Terracotta Army, but the practical work of salvage continued because there was still more treasure to recover. The team had only explored a fraction of La Magnifica's cargo holds. Estimates suggested that remaining gold and silver could total nearly another $300 million. The deep-sea equipment, though functioning reliably now, was operating in an environment where pressure and temperature created constant material stress. Each dive was pushing the equipment to its limits, and the team knew that every additional week of operations increased the risk of catastrophic failure. Kensington made the decision to intensify operations. He brought in additional vessels, additional ROVs, and additional personnel. The expedition, originally planned for 6 months, had now extended to nearly 18 months. New protocols were established to allow multiple ROVs to work simultaneously, carefully coordinated to prevent interference or collision at 3,000 meters below the surface. The coordination was extraordinarily complex. Imagine trying to perform intricate surgery with robotic instruments controlled from thousands of kilometers away, in absolute darkness, under crushing pressure, with visibility limited to whatever your equipment's lights can illuminate, and with the knowledge that any mistake could result in irreversible loss of multi-million-dollar equipment and invaluable historical artifact. That was the operating environment, day after day. One of the secondary averages, designated Profundis B, discovered something remarkable that the initial survey had missed: a secondary debris field, approximately 150 meters away from the main wreck. This debris suggested that when La Magnifica struck El Viechero, the impact had been violent enough to scatter cargo across a much wider area than initially calculated. In this secondary field, the team found additional seal containers, gold ingots that had apparently spilled from damaged holds, and most intriguingly, personal items belonging to the crew. A rosary, its beads still intact, made of jade and silver. A chess set carved from bone, each piece perfectly preserved. Letters sealed in protective containers, written in 17th century Spanish by crew members to families they would never see again. These items, worthless in pure monetary terms, carried immeasurable human and historical significance. They represented the lives of real people, sailors, officers, merchants, and slaves, whose stories had been erased by the ocean for 3 centuries. The discovery of the personal effects sparked a different kind of international engagement. Historians and genealogy researchers began attempting to identify the individuals represented by these artifacts. Descendants of crew members were located in Spain, Colombia, Peru, and even in North America. For many of these descendants, the discovery of their ancestors' personal possessions was emotionally overwhelming. The story shifted gradually from being primarily about treasure recovery to being about human recovery, about restoring the narrative of real people whose lives had been interrupted by disaster. The team was now working under pressure from multiple directions. Scientific institutions wanted extended research time to study the artifacts. Museums wanted immediate access to create exhibitions. Governments were demanding resolution of competing claims. Insurance companies were calculating payouts. Salvage investors were expecting returns. And through it all, Kensington's team remained focused on the singular objective: extract the treasure, preserve the artifacts, document everything with meticulous precision, and do it all without making catastrophic errors 3 kilometers below the surface. By month 16 of the expedition, the team had recovered a total of 87 additional chests containing precious metals, over 230,000 additional gold coins, 43 cases of silver ingots, and hundreds of artifacts. The total treasure value had climbed to $583 million. The historical documentation collected was now filling multiple databases accessible to researchers worldwide. The journal of Captain Rodriguez had been digitally preserved and translated into 12 languages. But as the expedition entered its final phase, tensions began surfacing. The original investors were demanding accelerated timelines and maximum extraction. The scientific community was arguing for more methodical, research-specific protocols. The governments involved in the territorial claims were threatening legal action. Media attention, which had been intense, was beginning to shift as other news cycles took precedence. Kensington called one final meeting with his core team. The decision was made to conduct one final, comprehensive survey of the wreck site, after which operations would cease. This survey would use advanced 3-dimensional mapping technology to create a complete digital record of the wreck in its current state, documenting everything that would be left behind. This digital archive would be made available to international researchers in perpetuity, essentially creating a permanent, accessible record of the discovery that no future team could improve upon or contest. That final survey took 6 weeks. When it was complete, when the last ROV had been recovered, when the final equipment had been secured, when the research vessel turned away from the coordinates that had captured the world's attention for nearly 2 years, the deep ocean reclaimed its solitude. La Magnifica remained 3,000 meters below the surface, no longer a secret, no longer a mystery, but now a documented, studied, recorded part of human history. The treasure that had been carried to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean by violence and conspiracy in 1687 had finally been brought into the light of the modern world, revealing not just the material wealth of an empire, but the human stories embedded within it. The recovery and its aftermath transformed understanding of colonial Spanish maritime commerce, challenged existing theories about transatlantic trade networks, and created a precedent for how international collaboration could resolve complex maritime salvage challenges in the most hostile environment on Earth. The $580 million in recovered treasure, significant as it was, ultimately became secondary to the historical narrative and human recovery that the expedition had achieved. The implications continue to ripple outward. Universities have established research centers dedicated to analyzing the Rodriguez Journal. Descendants of crew members have organized memorial services at sea. Insurance companies have revised their actuarial models for maritime loss. Deep-sea salvage companies have adopted protocols pioneered by Kensington's team as industry standards. And somewhere in the archives and museums that now house the artifacts and documents, the story of La Magnifica continues to be told, studied, debated, and reinterpreted. What began as a mysterious set of coordinates found in a dusty logbook in Buenos Aires had evolved into one of the most significant maritime discoveries in human history. A discovery that demonstrated that even in the deepest, darkest parts of our oceans, there are still secrets waiting to be found, stories waiting to be told, and human connections waiting to be restored. But the recovery operation itself represented only the first act of an ongoing drama that would continue to unfold across continents through courtrooms, museums, academic institutions, and conservation laboratories. The treasure had been brought to the surface, but the real battleground was just beginning to take shape. A battleground where history, law, national pride, and scientific inquiry would clash in ways that no one could have entirely predicted. Within weeks of Kensington's team confirming the scale of the discovery, the competing claims began in earnest. The Spanish government, through its Ministry of Culture and Justice, filed an immediate claim asserting that as the original sovereign power that owned La Magnifica and her cargo, Spain retained perpetual ownership rights regardless of the vessel's 300-year submersion. Legal precedent was cited. Similar cases involving Spanish galleons in international waters had resulted in Spanish courts asserting ownership claims even after centuries of separation from the Crown's jurisdiction. The Spanish argument was straightforward and compelling. The Crown had never formally abandoned the vessel, had never relinquished title, and therefore maintained sovereign ownership of everything contained within La Magnifica. Colombia presented a different but equally formidable claim. As the inheritor of Spanish colonial territories, particularly the Viceroyalty of New Granada, from which much of the cargo had originated, Colombia argued that colonial precedent suggested that the treasure rightfully belonged to the territorial successor states of the regions where the wealth had been extracted. The gold, silver, and emeralds that La Magnifica was carrying had come from Colombian soil, mined from Potosi and transported through Cartagena, and therefore, Colombian legal theorists contended the treasure represented wealth that had been stolen from Colombian peoples and should be repatriated. This argument carried powerful moral weight, particularly in light of historical narratives of colonial exploitation and resource extraction. Peru, whose colonial mines had also contributed significantly to the cargo manifest, filed a similar claim. Mexico, which had territories that shipped goods aboard La Magnifica joined the fray. Even the United States, citing salvage rights under international maritime law and the fact that Kensington's salvage team had American investors and personnel, submitted preliminary claims suggesting that significant portions of recovered materials should remain under American jurisdiction pending legal resolution. Kensington himself, representing the salvage company and private investors who had funded the expedition, claimed entitlement to salvage rights under established maritime law. The salvage law doctrine, recognized internationally, stipulated that those who successfully recovered property in maritime peril were entitled to compensation, typically ranging from 10 to 50% of the recovered value, depending on the risks undertaken and the success achieved. Kensington's legal team argued that without private initiative, capital, and expertise, La Magnifica would have remained eternally hidden in the depths of the ocean. The salvage rights were therefore not just legally justified, but morally necessary to incentivize future discovery and preservation of lost historical assets. What emerged was a complex, multi-layered legal dispute that would ultimately require negotiation, arbitration, and potentially international court intervention. For the first year following the recovery, the recovered materials were held in secure facilities under international custody, pending legal resolution. Museums worldwide submitted urgent requests for access to display portions of the materials. Insurance companies calculated their exposure based on centuries-old policies and modern valuations. Governments negotiated behind closed doors about how to resolve the competing claims without destroying relationships or precedent. The scientific community, meanwhile, faced an entirely different set of pressures. The materials recovered from La Magnifica represented an unprecedented opportunity to study an intact deep ocean ecosystem preserved in time. The wooden structures of the ship, the artifacts, the seabed materials associated with the wreck, all of it contained invaluable data about 17th century manufacturing, maritime construction techniques, trade networks, and environmental conditions across 3 centuries. Conservators recognized that the materials, once removed from their deep sea environment and brought to surface pressure, were at risk. The coins, preserved in anaerobic conditions, would begin oxidizing once exposed to air. The wooden structures, saturated with salt water, would begin deteriorating as they dried. The organic materials, leather, textiles, paper, were particularly vulnerable. The decision was made to establish a dedicated conservation facility funded jointly by international contributions, where the artifacts could be properly treated and preserved. This facility, established in a neutral location, eventually agreed to be Barcelona, Spain, became a center for international research and conservation efforts. Conservators from a dozen countries were brought in to collaborate on preservation protocols. The treatment process itself became educational, as conservators carefully desalinated the coins, removed rust, and stabilized wooden structures. They created detailed documentation of every step, which was made available to researchers and the public. The conservation process became, in effect, a second form of discovery, revealing details about manufacturing techniques, material composition, and historical practices that had been hidden for 3 centuries. The journal of Captain Rodriguez underwent similar intensive analysis. Historians, linguists, and archivists carefully analyzed the manuscript, documented its pages through high-resolution photography, and began the painstaking process of creating detailed translations and scholarly annotations. The journal revealed intricate details about the political conspiracies surrounding La Magnifica, naming individuals involved in the smuggling operation, describing the coded communications used between conspirators, and even speculating about where other shipments of smuggled treasure might have been hidden. For historians of Spanish colonial politics, the journal was essentially a Rosetta Stone, providing unprecedented insight into power struggles, international intrigue, and shadowy networks that had operated in the 17th century. But as the academic and historical value of the discovery became more apparent, a new tension emerged. governments and institutions began prioritizing the historical and scientific value of the materials over the monetary value. Museums across Europe and Latin America proposed collaborative exhibitions that would display portions of the recovered materials as historical artifacts rather than treasure. The framing shifted. Instead of talking about a gold discovery worth $500 million, the international media began emphasizing La Magnifica as a window into colonial history, a tragic story of human lives disrupted by conspiracy, and an unprecedented scientific and historical opportunity. The environmental impact of the salvage operation also became a subject of intense scrutiny. Deep ocean ecosystems, researchers cautioned, are extraordinarily delicate and fragile. The insertion of large ROVs, the disturbance of sediment, the placement of support structures on the seabed, all of this represented an intervention in an environment that humans rarely visit and understand poorly. Oceanographers and marine biologists requested access to the deep-sea survey data collected during the expedition. They wanted to study whether the salvage operation had negatively impacted the microbial communities, the chemosynthetic ecosystems, and the rare organisms that inhabited the deep ocean. The data, made available to the scientific community, revealed that while the localized disturbance had been significant, the broader ecosystem appeared to have suffered minimal lasting damage. The deep-sea organisms, it seemed, had adapted to the temporary intrusion and returned to normal patterns once the activity ceased. This finding led to an unexpected outcome. The Kensington expedition became a model for how deep-sea salvage operations could be conducted with environmental responsibility. The protocols developed during the operation, the careful mapping, the avoidance of unnecessary disturbance, the restoration of the seabed to its pre-operation state were adopted by other deep-sea industries. Oil companies, mining operations, and research initiatives all looked to the La Magnifica salvage operation as a demonstration that human activity in the deep ocean could be conducted within acceptable environmental parameters. Meanwhile, the question of how to divide the recovered materials remained unresolved. Spain and Colombia entered into bilateral negotiations. Peru sought to join the discussions. The international maritime law community convened conferences and seminars to debate the appropriate legal framework for resolution. Universities published law review articles proposing novel solutions. Some theories suggested that the materials should be considered shared cultural heritage and held in trust by an international body for the benefit of humanity. Others argued for strict application of traditional salvage law, which would give the salvage company a significant percentage and divide the remainder among the claimant nations based on historical ownership and connection. After 18 months of negotiation, a compromise emerged. Spain, as the original sovereign, would receive 30% of the recovered materials, particularly focusing on materials related to Spanish Crown affairs and administrative interests. Colombia and Peru would each receive 25%, reflecting their territorial and historical interests in the origin of the cargo. Kensington's salvage company and its investors would receive 15% as salvage rights compensation. A reduced percentage compared to traditional maritime law, but justified by the historical and cultural significance of the materials and the expectation of future research value. The remaining 5% would be held as a shared collection, displayed in rotation among international museums and available for collaborative research projects. The allocation formula satisfied no one completely, but it represented a workable compromise that acknowledged multiple legitimate claims and interests. More importantly, it established a precedent that future deep-sea discoveries might follow, a framework that balanced salvage rights, national claims, historical preservation, and public access to cultural heritage. The distribution of materials began in earnest 2 years after their recovery. The Prado Museum in Madrid received the first major shipment of materials related to Spanish Crown commerce and administration. The Gold Museum in Bogota displayed an extraordinary collection of Colombian origin precious metals and artifacts. The Museo Larco in Lima presented materials related to Peruvian colonial mines and trade networks, and the Barcelona Conservation Center, which had become a world-renowned institution through its work on La Magnifica's materials, retained the largest research collection available to international scholars. Exhibitions opened across the globe. The traveling exhibition La Magnifica History Recovered visited 12 countries over 3 years, displaying selected materials alongside interactive displays explaining the discovery, recovery, and research process. The exhibition attracted millions of visitors. For many, seeing the coins, artifacts, and documents brought the abstract concept of colonial history into tangible personal reality. Children traced the paths of 17th century sailors, historians debated interpretations of the captain's journal, descendants of crew members visited the exhibitions to pay respects to their ancestors. The broader impact rippled through academic disciplines. Colonial historians revised their understanding of Spanish colonial trade networks based on evidence from La Magnifica's manifest. Economists studied the circulation and value of 17th century currency using the recovered coins as primary sources. Oceanographers developed new protocols for deep-sea research based on methodologies pioneered during the salvage operation. Conservation specialists around the world adopted desalination and stabilization techniques that had been developed for the La Magnifica materials. The story also became a cultural phenomenon in different regions. In Spain, La Magnifica was portrayed as a tragic loss of crown wealth, a victim of conspiracy and the chaos of 17th century power politics. In Colombia and Peru, the narrative emphasized the recovery of stolen colonial treasure, a symbolic repatriation of wealth that had been extracted from indigenous lands centuries earlier. In the United States and Europe, the emphasis was on the scientific achievement, the technological innovation, and the human drama of the expedition itself. Different audiences, the same materials, entirely different interpretations, each valid, each reflecting the cultural and historical perspectives of the communities engaging with the story. Elena Vasquez, the historian whose initial research had sparked the entire expedition, became an unexpected public figure. She published a comprehensive historical monograph titled The Rodriguez Conspiracy: Power, Wealth, and Hidden Histories in the 17th Century Atlantic, which became an academic bestseller. She was invited to speak at universities, conferences, and museums. The historical mystery that had consumed her intellectual energy for decades had become a global phenomenon. When she stood in front of the exhibit at the Prado Museum, looking at the very materials she had theorized about during years of archival research, the emotional weight of the moment was overwhelming. The mystery had been solved. The treasure had been found. History had been made visible. Marcus Kensington, meanwhile, became a complex figure in the narrative. He was celebrated as an engineering visionary and entrepreneurial pioneer who had demonstrated that deep-sea salvage operations could be conducted at unprecedented depths with sophisticated technology and meticulous methodology. But he was also critiqued by some who argued that treasure hunting, regardless of how carefully conducted, represented a form of exploitation of cultural heritage. Some academics felt that the private profit motive had been inappropriate for materials of such historical significance. Others praised the fact that without Kensington's investment and expertise, the discovery would never have occurred, and therefore the entire debate about ownership and significance would have been moot. The discovery also prompted serious discussions about what other secrets might remain in the deep ocean. How many other shipwrecks laden with precious cargo and historical significance were still hidden in the abyssal darkness? What other conspiracies, mysteries, and human stories were preserved in the cold, high-pressure environment of the deep sea? The success of the La Magnifica expedition inspired a new wave of deep-sea exploration initiatives. Government agencies allocated funding for deeper expeditions. Private companies invested in advanced ROV technology. Universities established research programs dedicated to deep ocean archaeology and salvage operations. The deep ocean, once largely inaccessible and mysterious, was being opened up to systematic human exploration and research. Yet the expedition also raised important questions about the ethics and wisdom of intensive deep-sea exploitation. Some marine conservationists argued that the deep ocean should be treated as a preserve, left largely undisturbed except for careful scientific observation. Others contended that the benefits of discovery and historical preservation justified moderate intervention in deep-sea ecosystems. The debate continued unresolved as explorers and conservationists grappled with fundamental questions about humanity's relationship with the least known environment on Earth. As the years passed and the immediate excitement surrounding the discovery faded from mainstream media attention, La Magnifica's legacy continued to deepen and expand. Universities offered courses on the colonial history revealed by the Rodriguez Journal. Museums curated permanent exhibitions dedicated to the discovery and recovery process. Conservators published detailed technical papers on their treatment protocols. Historians cited the recovered materials and documents in their research. The 300-year-old mystery, once hidden in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean, had become integrated into humanity's ongoing conversation about history, science, technology, and cultural heritage. The story of La Magnifica ultimately transcended its origins as a treasure discovery. It became a story about human curiosity and ingenuity, about our drive to solve mysteries, to recover lost knowledge, to understand the past, and to bridge the gap between history and the present moment. It was a story about international cooperation and the ability of competing nations and interests to negotiate complex disputes in pursuit of shared understanding and mutual benefit. And it was a story about the deep ocean itself. That vast alien frontier that covers most of our planet, preserves untold secrets, and continues to challenge our assumptions about what is possible and what remains unknown. So when you think about that $580 million in gold discovered 3 kilometers beneath the ocean's surface, remember that the true treasure was never simply the precious metals themselves. The real treasure was the story. A story 3 centuries in the making. A story hidden in coordinates scrolled on the back of a dusty logbook. A story that required the dedication of historians, the expertise of engineers, the courage of deep-sea explorers, and the collaboration of international institutions to finally bring into the light. If you found this incredible maritime mystery fascinating, please hit that subscribe button to never miss our latest documentary explorations into history's greatest discoveries and unsolved ocean mysteries. Leave a comment below telling us which aspect of La Magnifica's recovery shocked you the most. And if you want to see more deep-sea discovery stories like this one, make sure to like this video and check out our playlist on underwater archaeology and shipwreck expeditions. Thank you for watching.